Okay, so I'll introduce our speaker very briefly as usual. It's great to have Dr. Andrew Charlton here for his, he's been to some of our functions before in different capacities, but this is the first time he's speaking here. So he's known to you well, so I'll introduce him very briefly. Studied at the University of Sydney and Oxford, PhD from Oxford. He's an economist. He's worked in business in Australia and elsewhere. He's worked with the United Nations. He's worked at the London School of Economics. He was advisor to the Prime Minister between 2008 and 2010, and since the last election, the member for Parramatta. And tonight's topic, Dr. Charlton's going to talk on the topic of pivot to India, the Australian-Indian relationship. Many thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. It's a real honour to be invited to speak to the Sydney Institute. Thanks very much to AMP for hosting us. I haven't been inside this building since it was completed. I didn't know they were still building it, but it's terrific to be here with you all, and it's lovely to see so many friends in the audience. Thank you all for joining us. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My first trip to India was 20 years ago to launch a book that I'd written about the global economy. And at that time, I was struck by the audaciousness of the Indian project. That their post-independence vision was to simultaneously build, without possessing much basis for either, a modern industrial economy and an egalitarian democracy. And each time I went back to India, I became more fascinated by its chaotic national journey, from medieval powerhouse to colonial vassal to impecunious republic, and to its present incarnation as an emerging superpower. And last year, when I was elected to Parliament, I became the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of India. And I began a writing project to explore India's growth and its impact on Australia. And the outcome of that project is my book, Australia's Pivot to India, which is being published in October by Black Ink Press, that I'll be talking about tonight. When I began writing this book, I had a sense that Australia's relationship with India was on an upwards trajectory, but I didn't quite appreciate the extraordinary year that the bilateral relationship had in store. This year, Prime Minister Modi visited Australia, becoming the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Australia twice. And later this year, Prime Minister Albanese will visit India, becoming the first Australian Prime Minister to visit India twice in 1 year. No less than 12 Australian ministers have travelled to India this year, which is already a record, and it's only August. It's an exhausting time to be a diplomat in the Australia-India relationship, as our former High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell will no doubt tell you. This unprecedented level of activity is not an accident. It reflects the fact that India's role in the world and its importance to Australia is accelerating perhaps more than any other country. This year, India became the largest nation in the world by population. And the last time that title changed hands was at the fall of the Roman Empire. And India is now growing so quickly that by 2070, its population will rival China, the United States, and the European Union combined. India also has the fastest economic growth of any major nation. It has the second largest armed forces and the fastest growing military capability in the world. So projecting forward from where we are today, it is hard to overstate the influence of India on our world in the coming decades. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that just as the 20th century was dominated by the United States and the 19th century was ruled by the British Empire, we might well end the 21st century with India on top. But India's inexorable superpower trajectory isn't just evident in the numbers. It is palpable on the streets. Driving, running, selling, begging, cooking, shouting and sitting, there is a sense of anticipation among the people of India. In every village, in every city, you can feel the fast dawning realization that what happens here will change the world. And this is not all distant geopolitics for us in Australia. India's rise is also changing us here at home. Migration from India has massively accelerated in the last 3 decades, and Indian Australians are by far the largest growing ethnic group. They recently overtook Chinese-born Australians and New Zealand-born Australians and are on track to take over the number of Australians born in the United Kingdom. At that point, they will become Australia's largest group of first-generation migrants. And already the Indian diaspora in Australia has blossomed into an extraordinary community, numbering more than 1 million people. Nearly one in 25 Australians has Indian heritage. So putting these two facts together, India's global rise and the growth in Indian migration to Australia leads to the inescapable conclusion that India will change Australia inside and out in the coming decades. As India is on the cusp of becoming a global superpower and Indian Australians head towards becoming our largest migrant group, the purpose of the book is to analyse Australia's modern relationship with India in its period since independence. This book isn't a hagiography of the bilateral relationship. It isn't a starry-eyed attempt at painting a rosy picture of the future. It asks 3 hard-headed questions. First, why was the relationship between Australia and India so weak for so long? What role can we realistically expect India to play in Australia's future? And how can we ensure that we support the Indian diaspora in Australia to be a successful wave of migration? Now, the first of these questions has been a topic of much debate in the foreign affairs community for a long time. It seemed more than paradoxical for Australia and India, who shared so many bonds of history, demography, language and geography, to have such a weak relationship for so much of our diplomatic history. After all, India was the first Asian nation with which Australia had diplomatic relations, and we were one of the first nations in the world to establish relations with India. So why did our relationship never take off? Well, it wasn't for lack of trying. The desirability of a warm relationship with India had been affirmed and reaffirmed by every Prime Minister in Australia from Chifley to Albanese. Motivated by strategic logic, fuelled by cultural enthusiasm, successive Australian governments have sought to build a deep relationship with India. But in the words of Ian Hall, one of Australia's foremost India analysts, these attempts have been fitful, but they have not always borne fruit. Indeed, for 6 decades, bilateral relations were characterised by misconceptions, lack of trust, neglect, missed opportunities, and even hostility. In the 1950s, the relationship between Australia and India had sunk so low that Paul Hasluck, who would go on to serve as Minister for External Affairs, described Australia's relationship with India as worse than any other country, including Russia. In the 1960s, we clashed over apartheid in South Africa and the war in Vietnam. In the 1970s, Gough Whitlam felt compelled to admit that there was something missing in the relationship. And the Department of Foreign Affairs concurred that India's importance to Australia was recognised, and I quote, perhaps more in the breach than the observance. In the 1980s, Australian diplomats described a sense of drift in the Australian relationship. And a Senate report in the 1990s concluded that our 2 countries were, quote, unusually distant in their relations. For all these decades, despite our bonds of history, geography, language, and sport, our relationship was rife with opportunities squandered and potential unrealised. Too often, the relationship comprised of what former diplomat Mark Pearce calls a series of forced dawns and first dates. And the important question is why? As we embark on a new chapter in our relationship with India, we have to diagnose the reasons for our historic failures so that we can lock in recent bilateral progress and build a plan to grow the relationship into the future. Now, there is no lack of introspection on this question within Australia's foreign policy establishment. Much has been written on the historic failures of the Australia-India relationship by eminent academics and researchers. And in the book, I canvass 4 possibilities for why Australia's relationship with India was so weak for so long. The first possible explanation, one that receives a lot of the attention in the literature, is the possibility that leaders were to blame. That failures of leadership, including inconsistent political attention and limited bureaucratic follow-through, caused the relationship to never take off. And it's true, of course, that leadership plays an important role in bilateral relations. It's difficult to disagree with Meg Gurry's assessment that we can trace the origins of the poor relationship with India over many decades to Menzies' lack of interest. Menzies and Nehru were such fundamentally different characters in almost every way. They failed to establish a strong personal relationship. They had contrasting ideologies and styles. They recognised few points of common national interest. And as a consequence, in those early years after Indian independence, Australia and India were never close. But we can't lay all the blame at Menzies' feet. Successive prime ministers that followed Menzies didn't have much more success. Whitlam became the first prime minister to visit India since 1959 when he was prime minister in 1973. And during that trip, Whitlam was at pains to redress the historic weakness in the bilateral relationship, at pains to point to a new Australian foreign policy that was more Asian-oriented and less Eurocentric. Whitlam declared, and I quote, "Our relations with India have not been given the attention they should have. If this has been so, I intend to amend it and amend it thoroughly." But in Whitlam's case, and not for the last time in the relationship, his fine words and strong intent were not backed up by substance or follow-through. And over the next 25 years, through the premierships of Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke, Keating and Howard, our relationship with India seemed stuck in a never-ending holding pattern. There was progress, there was an occasional step forward, there were setbacks, but the elements of substance that matter in a relationship were missing. Of this period, the great Allen Gyngell once quipped, "Every Australian government discovers India once and then promptly forgets about it." The second explanation for Australia's historically weak ties with India is that the relationship was constantly chipped at by bilateral frictions which undid the goodwill generated by political enthusiasm. And these various frictions and issues in the relationship created a stop-start dynamic. Australia's issues with India and India's issues with Australia generally tended over these decades to focus on 2 broad themes. One was race and one was security. On race, of course, the White Australia policy cast a long shadow over the relationship. And that persisted even into recent decades with the Hanif case and the violence against international students in Australia, which both further inflamed racial issues. And on security, Australia clashed with India several times on the issue of nuclear weapons and India's ties with the Soviet Union and Australia's apparent closeness to the United States. Now, these frictions unquestionably led to setbacks in the relationship. They unquestionably created distance. But I argue in the book that their existence and their ability to distract and derail the relationship is evidence of a deeper weakness, a deeper fragility in the relationship. And that fragility is what former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans used to refer to as ballast in the bilateral relationship. Ballast is what is needed to maintain bilateral communications and continuity when agreement broke down. And while those previous two explanations, weak leadership or poor diplomatic follow-through and bilateral friction, certainly contributed to a weak relationship, the primary problem was a hollowness at the core of the economic and strategic relationship, a lack of commercial and geopolitical ballast. To begin with the economic side, Australia and India just fundamentally lacked common economic interests for most of our history. We were forging strong and roaring economic relationships with many of the East Asian economies. We had strong trade and investment patterns, but with India, we never built a strong trading relationship, and our investment was always negligible. In 1990, an Australian newspaper lamented that nothing has succeeded in prizing open the door to the Indian economy. Despite decades of attempts, our economic relationship seems to be perennially in the first gear. And this seemed like a puzzle. Why was Australia able to build strong and dynamic trading relations with our East Asian neighbours, and yet with India, a nation with whom we had a lot in common historically, geographically, similarities of language, we could never build a strong economic relationship? Counterintuitively, it might have been precisely the similarities between Australia and India that were responsible for keeping us apart. India's colonial history and its democratic institutions forced it into an economic model with minimal complementarities to Australia's economy. India's economy, like every other economy, is a product in part of the development strategy that it chose in the post-war period. And the strategy that it chose was one very different to the East Asian economies. Whereas the East Asians pursued an export growth model built around strong capital investment, investments in factories and infrastructure, suppression of wages, keeping the currency low, all in an attempt to create an export manufacturing powerhouse, which they successfully did. And that export-oriented growth model was deeply complementary to Australia. It required an enormous amount of raw materials for all that capital investment and all that manufacturing, and Australia was only too happy to export our raw materials for that purpose. And it produced an enormous amount of manufactured goods, often at very cheap prices, and Australia was all too happy to import those manufactured goods. After the Second World War, though, India chose a different economic development strategy. Whereas the East Asians went through door A, the export-led growth model, the Indians went through door B, the import substitution model, a model that focused on self-reliance and poverty reduction rather than trade and investment. And they chose that model for a number of reasons, but not least was the power of sectional and business interests in their democracy and their history of colonial subjugation that meant they never wanted to be dominated by any other country, either politically or economically. But unfortunately for Australia, the economy that India created in this import substitution model was almost orthogonal to our economy. And while we built strong economic relationships with the East Asians, we had little to show for our economic relationship with India. So while we had a lot in common in terms of strong democratic traditions and historic links, those factors in some ways forced India into an economic model which pushed it away from Australia. And we didn't have the economic ballast in the relationship which could overcome bilateral frictions and which political leadership could build on and create a deep relationship. Ironically, what should have brought us together in those historic commonalities was, in an economic sense, what kept us apart. The second hollowness at the core of the Australia-India relationship, the second area in which we lacked ballast, to use Evans's term, was our strategic relationship. Now, we live in the first empire-free millennium in history, but the legacy of bygone empires still powerfully shapes our times. And Australia and India, both former British dominions, had very different colonial experiences that shaped our respective paths to independence and cast a long shadow over our national journeys. Australia and India's distinct colonial experiences have had profound effects on our relative approach to international affairs. And the two countries entered the post-war world with remarkably different worldviews, and they saw geopolitics through divergent lenses. India's experience of colonialism left it with an abiding fear of ever again being dominated by another country. This anxiety drove India's distrust of global superpowers, its determination to pursue its interests without joining either of the two Cold War blocs. As Nehru said, "We do not intend to be a plaything of others." And he would go on to be the principal author of India's non-alignment policy. India's centuries of oppression left it suspicious of superpowers and preferring multilateralism that was non-hegemonic, while Australia's more benign relationship with its colonial ruler made us more comfortable with great power geopolitics. On the one hand, you had India eschewing alliances in favour of non-alignment, while Australia was like a fresher at O Week, signing up to every possible pact and alliance from ANZUS to CETO. While India tried to avoid foreign military entanglements, Australia committed ourselves to conflicts including Malaya in 1950 and 1955, Korea in 1950 and Vietnam in 1965. For decades, our two countries were operating in entirely different strategic spheres. And to the extent that we had interactions, they were characterised by either indifference or discord. So these four factors contributed to Australia's weak relationship with India. Weak leadership, bilateral frictions, orthogonal economies, and strategic misalignment. Each factor played a part and others did, but I argue that the latter two were decisive. They robbed the relationship of a central core. We just didn't have the economic interests and the strategic alignment that forms the ballast for a deep relationship. When he visited Delhi in 1989, John Button observed, and I quote, "an unbridgeable gulf of time, distance and culture between Australia and India." The then industry minister felt a cool indifference in the senior Indian politicians and bureaucrats he met. He returned to Australia deflated, feeling that, and he wrote, "Australia was too far away, too small, and quite irrelevant to India's daily preoccupations." Button's sentiment more or less summarises the preceding 4 decades of unfulfilled promises and unrealised aspirations in Indo-Australian relations. But, slowly at first and then gathering pace, the tide of history began to draw India and Australia closer together. 3 events unfolding in the 1990s would radically change bilateral relations. The first event was the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR, which caused many countries to rethink their foreign policy, not least Australia and India. The second event was India's economic liberalisation in the 1990s that opened the door for stronger bilateral relations. India's liberalisation unleashed its economy, grew its middle class, and enabled much stronger business engagement with Australia. And the third event was the acceleration of Indian migration to Australia from the 1990s, which grew significantly as a result of changes in migration policy in Australia to focus more on skilled workers, as well as the growing mobility among India's middle class and rising educational opportunities. Now, none of these developments created breakthrough moments for the relationship on their own. But over time, they profoundly changed the bilateral context. Like a gradual blossoming of flowers and a bearing of fruit from seeds that had been planted many years earlier. And for many decades, Indian and Australian diplomats had summarised the strengths of our relationship in terms of the 3 Cs: cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth. And these were really overused cliches, which betrayed a shallow relationship. The 3 Cs gave a semblance of familiarity, but were a poor substitute for genuine connections in trade, investment, culture, security, and diplomacy. And as Australia's bond with India improved and developed more substance, Australian diplomats began to describe the relationship in different terms. And one Australian diplomat in particular invented a new term to describe Australia's relationship with India, and that is Barry O'Farrell. Barry started to describe the relationship not in terms of the 3 Cs, but in terms of the 4 Ds: democracy, defence, dosti or friendship, and the diaspora. And these 4 Ds describe a deepening in the relationship between Australia and India, new dimensions that were unlocked by the changes in the 1990s. They also changed the way that we thought about our old ties, and I love cricket as an example in this space. I think cricket is such an emblem for the changing relationship between Australia and India. Cricket used to be a sport that Australia played against India, and India played against Australia. Australian cricketers would travel halfway across the world where the pitches were slow and soft, the food was risky, and the weather was hot. But today, many of Australia's best players, both male and female, play alongside Indian players in the Indian Premier League, which has been instrumental in bringing cricketers from both countries together. Many Australian coaches and support staff have also participated in the IPL, creating friendships and collaborations that extend beyond the cricketing field. The IPL now accounts for more than 85% of the global cricket economy. It's a space in which Australians don't so much play against India as with India. The other element that I think cricket really brings to life in terms of Australia's relationship with India is the contribution that Australians with Indian heritage have made to Australian cricket here at home. Many Indian migrants have a great passion for the sport. And when you look at the Cricket Australia data, which lists every single cricket player in Australia that's registered with Cricket Australia, right from the juniors to the professionals, and you look at the surnames of those players, those thousands of players, the most common surname in Australian cricket, from the juniors to the professionals, is Singh. And the second most common surname in the Cricket Australia database is Smith. And the third most common surname in that database is Patel. The fourth most common is Jones. You can see the pattern. In cricket, as in so many other aspects of our bilateral relationship, our friendship has been unlocked by people-to-people links and the diaspora. And these people-to-people links are the most important element in Australia's new relationship with India. It has provided the ballast that was missing for so long. Back in 1965, shortly after his appointment as Australia's High Commissioner to India, Arthur Tangi sent a slightly agitated note to then Foreign Minister Paul Hasluck. Barry knows this anecdote. Arriving to find a listless diplomatic relationship, Tanguy wrote to his boss that while there was fertile ground between the two countries, no one seems to know what seed to plant. This quote was given to me shortly after I became chair of the Parliamentary Friends of India by my colleague Tim Watts, who is one of the great authorities on the Australia-India relationship in the Australian Parliament. Andrew, Tim said to me emphatically, we finally now know, after more than 50 years, what seed to plant in that fertile ground: the diaspora. Well, Australia is home to more than 1 million people with Indian heritage, nearly 1 in 25 Australians. As I said before, Indian Australians are the fastest growing of the nation's main ethnic groups. The number of people in Australia who are born in India has increased 7-fold in just 2 decades. Nearly a quarter of the 1 million people who arrived in Australia from other parts of the world between 2016 and 2021 were from India. And I'm lucky to represent many of them in the incredibly vibrant part of Sydney that is Parramatta and Little India around Harris Park. And as I said earlier, on current projections, Indian-born Australians will soon become the largest migrant group. These migrants are making a massive contribution to Australia. And in the book, I talk about politics, media, culture. I'm just going to give you a couple of facts about this migrant group. Indian migrants to Australia are fabulously well qualified, and I mean that word fabulously. Indian-born residents have much higher levels of educational attainment than other residents. 64% of Indian migrants have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 26% of other Australian residents. That means that Indian-born Australians are more than twice as likely to have a university degree. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that they are more than twice as likely to have a professional or managerial role, because the level of under-occupation of Australians with an Indian heritage is incredibly high. More than half of Indian-born people working as labourers have a tertiary degree in Australia, compared to 4% of Australian-born people working in labouring who have a tertiary degree. Similarly, 47% of Indians working as machinery operators and drivers have a degree, compared to 3% of Australians working in those same fields. And this disparity speaks to an opportunity to better support Indian migrants and more readily recognise their skills. Indian migrants have made an enormous contribution to Australian politics. In the New South Wales election, we had the extraordinary achievement of having a number of Australians of Indian descent win office. Karishma Kalyanda, who migrated to Australia from India as a 4-year-old, won the seat of Liverpool. Gurmesh Singh, a 4th-generation migrant of Sikh Punjabi descent, retained the seat of Coffs Harbour. The new Deputy Premier, Prue Car, has Indian heritage through her father, who hails from West Bengal. The incoming Treasurer, Daniel Mukhi, whose parents were Punjabi migrants, made history as the first minister to be sworn in on the Bhagavad Gita. A few months ago, my friend Samir Pandey became the Lord Mayor of Parramatta, the first Lord Mayor in Australia of Indian heritage. And Indians are having a massive impact on Australian culture and media. I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about the future of the relationship, because the current strength of the relationship owes much to the efforts of our Foreign Minister Penny Wong, our Defence Minister Richard Marles, and the Prime Minister, all of whom have prioritised this bilateral relationship. And it also reflects the substantial role that each of us hopes that the other will play in our future. Although, if we're honest, neither nation is entirely clear about exactly what part it's willing to play or exactly what it expects of the other. Australia perhaps hopes that India will help promote regional security and allow us to participate in its extraordinary economic growth. India perhaps hopes that Australia will continue to substantially and symbolically support its recognition as a first-rank global power. And whether or not we're able to fulfill each other's aspirations depends on how our relationship develops in the future. And as with any friendship, its real strength is only tested in challenging times. And Australia should not make the mistake of thinking that expressions of friendship are an alliance that implies any formal or exclusive obligation. Australia in a changing world is looking for economic and strategic partners. We want India to be both of those things. But we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of wishful thinking. India may become a strong economic partner of Australia's, but if it does, it won't be in the old model of the East Asian economies, because the Indian economy is fundamentally different. And wishing it were the same as the East Asian models and we can trade with it in the same way will not work. And India is also becoming an increasingly important strategic partner. But that partnership will not be a facsimile of the Australia-US alliance. Australia's pivot to India should aspire instead to build a distinctive relationship that goes beyond transactional engagement and circumstantial alignment. It requires us to take a warm friendship that's been produced by favourable circumstances since the 1990s and turn it into a genuine partnership. And the essence of that partnership is to deepen the relationship with mutual investment in common endeavours across every sphere of our interactions. And if we do that, we'll forge a mutually beneficial relationship with one of the most important powers of the 21st century. And we will strengthen Australia both inside and out. Thanks very much.
Just get in there for a second. So, to Dr. Charlton, many thanks for an informative and challenging address tonight. Now, I'll just make a few points. First, thanks to AMP for this facility tonight, which is a terrific facility. First time we've been here. Now, we'll buy copies of Andrew Charlton's book when it comes out in October, and we'll get you when you're in the city of CBD of Sydney to sign some, and we'll put it up on our website and we'll sell them. Then, are you happy to do that?
Thank you.
Okay, and now we're coming to questions and comment. We've got about 20 minutes, so questions broadly on the topic. If I could just start off, and everyone's got to be fairly brief, a lot of people here. Going back to where you started with Menzies and Nehru, it's probably fair to say, I think, that India took a different, you've covered some of this in your speech, approach. India really went with the third world and was pretty soft on Moscow. Pakistan, on the other hand, went with the United States. And you would not have expected that, really, but it did. And so what Menzies was confronting really was a power based in Delhi or New Delhi, which really wasn't compatible with Australia's allies, either Britain or the United States or allies within the region. So did Nehru take the wrong tack, in your view?
Well, I think he did take the wrong tack. I don't say that because of Australia. I say it because I think ultimately India made a decision to change tack. They pursued a policy of non-alignment, which was flush with idealism for a new post-colonial world after the Second World War. It was one of the most admirable, noble and beautiful sentiments, I think, their view of what the post-war strategic alignments should look like. Unfortunately, the rest of the world didn't follow. And suddenly, quite shortly, India found itself in a very hostile environment. It had a war with several of its neighbours within the first couple of decades of independence, not least its devastating war with China and its ongoing conflict with Pakistan. Ironically, it was, unlike Australia, India found itself in a very hostile neighbourhood with fractious land borders, whereas Australia found itself in a relatively peaceful neighbourhood surrounded by sea. So I think ultimately India did decide to take a different tack away from Nehruvian non-alignment. I think the policies of the current Foreign Minister, Jaishankar, are quite different to that, but in some ways they have similarities. Jaishankar's policy of multi-engagement, which means engaging with many parties at the one time, sounds like it's diametrically opposed to Nehru's non-alignment, but it has one critical element in common, and that is that India likes to keep its options open. And I think as we think about what we hope India will be in terms of a partner for Australia, what role we hope it plays in the world, we need to remember that fact.
Okay, I've got a question here from our Zoom. Was the focus on the rise of China a factor in the relative inattention to the Australia-India relationship?
I think it provides a really important contrast to the Australia-India relationship. You know, China and, for that matter, many of the other East Asian countries were nations that we had much less in common with than India. We had fewer historical connections, fewer cultural connections, more distant geographic connections in some cases. We didn't have the commonalities of democracy or language, and yet we built quite strong relations with those countries. As I said in my speech, and as I articulate in more detail in the book, I think that comes down to the fundamental ballast that we had in our relations with those countries. Complementary economies that provided the foundation to build a strong diplomatic relationship. And so China does provide a strong point of contrast. Also, China ultimately, Australia's relationship with China changed a lot when it flipped development models, which it did earlier than India. It flipped into an export-led development model, and that opened up enormous opportunities for commercial development with Australia. India, much slower to do that, persisted much longer with import substitution to the cost of our bilateral relationship.
Just stay with me. There's a question here. Speaking.
Shall I? Yep. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Gerard. Gail Pearson. Thank you very much for your. Oh, it seems to be echoing, but anyway, we'll ignore that. Thanks very much for a very stimulating talk about the Australian-India relationship from the Australian perspective. I've been engaged with India for a very long time, since the 1970s, in various capacities. And it's my observation that when the relationship is up, it's because India has wanted us. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. And further, I wonder if you have a comment on whether India will continue to want us.
Yeah, I think that is a very reasonable observation. I mean, the relationship is up when both countries want each other, and at different points, I think Australia has wanted India, and at different points, India has wanted Australia. What does India really want from Australia right now? I think a few things. I think India sees itself as a global superpower. It is a global superpower, and it's going to grow in its power over the coming decades. And Australia can play a role in recognising and facilitating India's transition into that superpower role. I think it's important for superpowers to have good relations with states that support them and recognise them, and Australia can play that role. The second thing that India needs right now is capital. It is in a phase of very capital-hungry economic growth, and Australia has one of the largest pension systems in the world. The trillions of dollars of Australian superannuation money are meaningful in global scales, and they're meaningful to India. At the speed at which India's economy is growing, I'm not sure that Australia's capital markets will be significant for India for very long. India will reach a point in its growth over the coming decades where Australia is a marginal piece of that capital need, but right now we could be a material piece. I think that is a very important part of the Australia-India relationship that we need to develop. And if I think about moving from a friendship or a relationship of transactions and circumstance to a real partnership, that's one of the key elements. You know, if Australians had some of their superannuation invested in India, I think young Australians would feel like India's success was, in a very practical sense, their success. We were benefiting from the fastest economic growth in the world, and that was directly contributing to our well-being. And I think if Indians knew that Australian superannuation was invested in their country, helping them grow and build factories and bridges and ports, they would feel like they had a very real stake in our success. So building that investment relationship, taking advantage of the complementarity in capital markets that we have right now when India does need us for that purpose, I think is a very important part of the relationship. Not one that we have done well at seizing so far, but one that we can seize.
There's a question here. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charlton. Just want to ask, given your extensive experience and understanding on international markets and trade policy, including experience in G20 meetings, what do you see as the greatest trade and economic opportunities that are still present for Australia and India?
Well, I'll tell you one that I talk about in the book that I think is massively under-recognised. Massively under-recognised. Australian companies employ people in India, as you all know. And they employ them in broadly two ways. They directly employ Indian employees, and Australian banks have employees of those banks. ANZ, Commonwealth Bank, there are people who are employees of those banks who work in India, in big cities in India. That's one way that Australians employ Indians directly in India. And the second way is that we employ them through third-party companies, through capability centres, delivery centres. These are companies like Accenture, TCS, HCL, TCS, and if you think about those two ways that Australian companies employ Indians, let's go through the ASX 20. Well, there are a couple of banks that through those two channels individually employ more than 20,000 Indians in headcount, direct plus indirect. There are a number of other companies as you go through that employ similar amounts. Pretty quickly, you don't need to get far into the ASX 30 before we are talking about, if you think about 20,000 in one company, you don't have to get far into the ASX 30 before you start getting up to 300,000, 400,000 people. Let me say that again. Australia's largest companies, in fact, a handful of Australia's largest companies, employ something like 300,000 or 400,000 people in India. Now, these people are not just on the phone doing call centre work. They are doing an extraordinarily wide range of skills and capabilities, from IT to marketing to a whole range of technology functions, payments processing. Now, Australian companies don't like talking about this. They don't like explaining that they have large headcounts abroad for understandable reasons. The Australian public isn't too happy with that outcome. But this is a huge part of Australia's relationship with India, a massive economic link between our two countries, and a link that delivers an enormous amount of value to Australian companies. Value that, frankly, if it was turned off, I'm not sure what many Australian companies would do to get that capability. That 300,000 or 400,000 is like 2% of Australia's labour force living in India, working for us. So there are lots of elements of the economic relationship which are fundamentally different to the old economic relationship that we had with other countries, including the East Asians. We need to recognise those, build on them, and if we do, will build a very powerful but different economic relationship with India.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. There's a question down the back, and we're coming up here and down there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll stand. Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. And just so you know, 10 years from now, I'll be sitting right here waiting to listen to your conversation around Australia-Africa relations. So I'm giving you 10 years to prepare your speech for that, so I'll be here to listen. I wanted to ask a question about what you mentioned around the disparity between educational attainment and the nature of employment or underemployment, particularly for diaspora populations. It states here that Parramatta boasts the second highest number of PhDs per capita in the Sydney area. So I just wanted to know, what are you doing in Parramatta, as well as in that space, to reduce that level of disparity and to harness this intellectual capability, particularly of diaspora populations, and how can higher education support that mission further? Thank you.
Yeah, well, Australia's higher education relationship with India is one of the really important, one of the other really important elements in our bilateral relationship. We have an enormous number of Indian students who come to Australia. And they make a very large contribution to Australia while they're here and also after they finish their studies. There are really two answers to your question. The first is the Albanese government has made a lot of progress in mutual recognition of skills between Australia and India. And that will help to chip away at the underemployment problem that we have here, as well as enabling Australian education providers to provide education in India that students in India then know they can use in Australia and other places. So that mutual recognition is the first plank. The second thing is, and this was an announcement just this week, if you were coming to Australia as an international student, it used to benefit you, in fact it would harm you greatly if you didn't, if you would say that you had no intention of staying in Australia. So most international students coming to Australia, paying their thousands of dollars to come here, were encouraged, in fact, almost forced by our migration system to disavow any intent of staying in Australia. Now, for many of them, that wasn't true. And frankly, nor should it be. Australia wants to have migrants come to Australia, particularly migrants who come with skills and higher education, and we want to encourage them to come to Australia for the purpose of getting their education, and also, if they are highly skilled and demanded in the Australian labour market, we want to encourage them to stay. So just last week, we changed that in the migration system, and there's now no benefit to correctly or falsely disavowing interest in staying in Australia after your studies if you're coming here as a student.
Now we've got time for three more. Got to be brief. So there's one here, Michael the first and Michael the second.
Hey, Salvatore Babonis, thank you for the deep historical dive into Australia-India relations. It was a great pleasure to have an hour of India commentary, intelligent India commentary, without hearing the name Narendra Modi. But I've pricked the bubble. Narendra Modi, of course, is the deeply conservative Prime Minister of India from a deeply conservative party. Anthony Albanese leads a party that is nothing if not deeply conservative. He seems very comfortable working with Narendra Modi, but I wonder how much the Labour Party as a whole feels comfortable with the developing relationship with India.
Well, the Labour Party feels very positive about Australia's relationship with India. It is growing in almost every aspect of that relationship. Economically, strategically, through education, through joint diplomatic cooperation. We see India as an extremely important partner in all of those spheres. And that's why the diplomatic effort that has gone into the relationship has gone into it. As I said, 12 Australian ministers have travelled to India this year already. Prime Minister Albanese will visit India twice this year, becoming the first Prime Minister to do so. We certainly see India as an important partner for the future, and I think that speaks to the intensity of the diplomatic effort and the amount of political enthusiasm in the relationship.
Okay, no, hang on, you've got it. Okay, sorry.
Just got the mic, just turn it on. Is it green?
Oh, it is on. I wanted to be the first person to...
We can't hear you. You've got to speak into the microphone.
But now I'm...
Michael, you've got to speak in...
Michael,
Okay.
just turn it on. It needs to be green. Just push it, button.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to be the first person to mention Modi, and now I'm the second. But I wanted to know, what do you think about the nature of the government, which I think is the first government in India with no Muslims in the cabinet of India? And what do you see as the potential problem areas in terms of Australia-India relations, and whether human rights is amongst that?
Yeah. Well, as with any country, Australia likes to stand up for human rights, and our values of democracy and pluralism and press freedom are important to us, and we encourage those around the world. India is a complex story. Narendra Modi's premiership has seen tens of millions of people be lifted out of poverty. Extraordinary progress in social dimensions, in education, in technology. Hundreds of millions of people banked who were not previously banked. People right across the country who can now have transaction accounts, savings accounts, invest for the future. So not everything in India is perfect. Australia, of course, will always stand up for human rights and our values. And I think that what we want to see is an India which continues on the trajectory that it has been on for the last several decades, that Narendra Modi has contributed to in no small part, and become a partner as a nation like Australia that wants to promote democracy and freedom and pluralism at home and around the world.
Question here.
Yeah, and
you go talking to the camera.
Okay. Andrew Michael Collins, also from the Australian Labor Party, so great to...
There are two of us here, Mike.
Yeah, that's... Well, I've been here a long time, there's been many Labor people sit here. But just on the diaspora, look, you've already covered the power of the Indian diaspora in Australia. And I've had the great pleasure to work in the last 12 years in a lot of New South Wales public sector agencies with many great, well-educated Indians. In fact, I'm an economist, and I remember being taught by many great Indian economists who are from Oxford and Cambridge and whatever. So I just want you to sort of go back to that. We're at a point now where India has an incredible influence in Australian bureaucracies, private, public, and also I've had a Punjabi business partner. We're not active in business now, but, you know, and having worked in IT services, but I want you to just go back to that, because I don't think people understand there are many highly well-educated Indians on top of the public service in New South Wales doing great work.
Look, you are absolutely right. And if you look at the CEOs of some of Australia's largest companies now and in recent time, Orica, Link, Stockland, you know, we have Australians of Indian descent who are now leading some of our biggest companies and making a massive contribution in business. But I just want to say one more thing about democracy to Michael's question. You know, in defence of Indian democracy, I think we need to recognise that India proved a very important point to the world, which was, you know, when I was growing up, the high school debating topic was, can you be a democracy and develop? And the people who are on the negative side of those arguments often won the debates because people believed that democracy was a hindrance to economic growth. They believed that, in some cases, democracy was condemning countries to poverty. That you needed to have a strong central government like the East Asians that could get things done if you wanted to get out of poverty. That was the belief, not amongst everybody, but amongst a lot of people. And in defence of Indian democracy, in the last 20 years, they have proved to the world that that is not true. India is the world's largest democracy. They have delivered enormous economic growth over the last 3 decades. They have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And they are now a demonstration to the world that you can be a democracy and economically successful. And Australia is a demonstration to the world that you can be a pluralist, diverse, multicultural society and a strong democracy. And so India and Australia, I think, we both have weaknesses, of course, but in those critical points, we are individually and together great advertisements for what democracy can do and can be compatible with. And we didn't believe that 30 or 40 years ago.
Many thanks. There are more questions, but we always finish on time. Look, thanks to Dr. Charlton for a very important message tonight and very clearly stated. It'll have considerable influence on the public debate here, both tonight and when your book comes out in October. And as I said, we'll get copies and sell them to our members and sell them online. But for tonight, thanks for giving up your time, valuable time, to speak to the Sydney Institute. And I'm glad you made a really good job of it. Thank you.